majority of my research looks at the effects of atmospheric pollution, so from polluting economic activity, and looking at how that affects a range of outcomes. So that could be how well you do in school, or how well you do in the labour market, or how many hours you work. And that's interesting because we know relatively well what the benefits are of economic activity, even polluting economic activity. You can get jobs from this, you can produce good, interesting products that we might want, but it's more difficult to assess the costs. So why is that relevant? In most of the developed world, pollution is something that is getting better, thankfully. That's not true worldwide. So a lot of industrializing cities in places like India or China, where vast percentages of the world's population live, have very high levels of atmospheric pollution. People are exposed to high levels every day throughout their normal lives, but also you get these big spikes in pollution which happen every so often, and those are particularly costly. So one of my projects looks at the effects of these kind of spikes in pollution, of the kind that you would see in places like Mumbai or Beijing, or dozens of cities around the world. And what this project does is I look at something that happened long ago in England, which is the Great London Smog of 1952. This was a 4 or 5 day event in which suddenly levels of pollution got far higher. They were 2 or 3 times higher than you would expect. And what this project does is it looks at the effect of this for the cohort that were affected in utero or as very young infants at the time. And in this project, I can observe people's whole lives because this happened in 1952. So you can look at how people did in education. People were far less likely to have an A-level, those that were exposed, or to have a degree. And you can look at how people do in the early labour market. So this is what you choose to do, what kind of career you choose to do, and how well you work early in your work life really affects your whole quality of life. And if you look at the people that were affected by the Great London Smog, they were less likely to be educated, and so they were doing different kinds of jobs. They were able to work far fewer hours at the age of 20, 30, and even at 40 than those that were unaffected by the smog. And if you really look at people over the very long term, there's some evidence that they're more likely to develop these very long-term diseases. So the cohort that were affected as very young babies, they were more likely to develop cancers by the time I observed them at the age of about 60. And so this and other research of its type shows that the costs of atmospheric pollution are far higher than you would expect if you just look at what's happening right now. So there is research that looks at what happens if pollution is bad now. Do you work less? Are you more likely to go to hospital? But this line of research shows that these effects can really persist for a very long time. In this case, it was up to 60 years you were having effects. For the entire working life, people were affected by these things. Which means that if you try and assess what the whole costs are of exposure to atmospheric pollution, you have to look at these things that can scar your whole life, essentially. The levels of pollution in London are, in a global scale, not as bad as you would think, but they do have effects on a wide range of things. So contemporaneous exposure, for example, has been linked to people working fewer hours. It's been linked to things like violent crime. It's been linked to people doing less well on exams. And so the effects of the kind of pollution that you would see in London are likely to colour almost every aspect of people's lives in ways that it's important to measure.